You're excited to start with smart home technology, you've already decided on Home Assistant, and you're wondering where is the best place to install it. Maybe you have an old computer lying around and would like to install it on that, or you have already acquired a Raspberry Pi. Perhaps you're also interested in getting a new computer and are wondering which one is the best. Additionally, there are several ways to install Home Assistant, so which one is the right choice? All of this and much more I will show you in this video, how you can set up Home Assistant from scratch in 2024. After the intro, we will get started. Have fun! So let's start with the right computer selection. Maybe you have an old computer lying around somewhere and are wondering if it wouldn't be cool to install Home Assistant on it. Maybe you also have an old NAS lying around somewhere or are currently using a NAS and are wondering if it makes sense to install Home Assistant on it. Maybe a Raspberry Pi, or you might consider getting a completely new computer. First of all, the big topic that I hear the most when it comes to the subject of home servers is performance. And I would say that for most people, this topic is actually negligible at first. Of course, there are applications that consume performance and for which you also need an appropriate server. However, for all those who are just starting out and might want to control a few lights or even run a Plex server, this is not really relevant at all. If you want to scale this up now and maybe, I don't know, run 50 streams simultaneously on the Plex server, then that's a different question. But if you come from the Windows world and have an old computer lying around that is actually no longer usable because it has too little performance, it should definitely be sufficient for Home Assistant, as Linux itself requires very little performance, and Home Assistant and most add-ons are generally situated in the lower performance range. Accordingly, even an old Raspberry Pi, so to speak, is sufficient. You can start with a Trio. A 4 or even a Raspberry Pi is definitely sufficient to get started. However, you should not forget about the issue of power consumption. And that is point 2. Because ideally, such a computer should run 24/7 at your home to keep your entire home automation system running throughout the day. Accordingly, the electricity costs can definitely be noticeable if you use an old computer for that. Therefore, I personally would rather not use old computers for this purpose. Maybe you can do other things with it, perhaps set up a test server or something that you only run occasionally. That's fine. However, if you run a server 24/7, smaller computers that are very energy efficient are more worthwhile. On one hand, a Raspberry Pi, due to having a USB connection, can only draw 5V and correspondingly 1, 2, maybe 3A. And yes, that is completely appealing. I'll show you the electricity costs that you can expect here. Alternatively, if you are not interested in a Raspberry Pi right now, because prices have become relatively high, you can also check eBay. There are now some thin clients available, and I will link them for you below in the description. I have now also installed my smart home on a thin client. These are old computers that are discarded from, for example, medical practices and were only used back then to connect to a large server. This means that several small computers in the doctor's office have connected to form a large server. Accordingly, they didn't have much performance, but they are now being replaced and can be found super cheaply on eBay, essentially used. It's definitely worth it, and when compared to a Raspberry Pi, it can sometimes be cheaper in terms of price and similar to slightly better in terms of performance. And it even has the advantage that you have a regular Windows, that is X, so-called X, processor architecture on it. In comparison, the Raspberry Pis use an ARM architecture, which is more commonly found in mobile processors, for example, and accordingly may not rank as high in terms of compatibility as X. By now, almost all applications actually work under ARM, but Windows, for example, does not. Accordingly, if you want to go for maximum compatibility and have a bit more performance, it might be worth taking a look at eBay. 2001. Next, we need to address the choice of Home Assistant, as there are several different installation options available. On one hand, there is the standard Home Assistant container. This is essentially just Home Assistant as it is, and it can actually be installed on any operating system, whether it's a NAS that you use, an old computer, or an existing Linux server that you have, perhaps with a Docker container or Raspberry Pi, so everything is really open. The disadvantage of this installation method is that you are missing the so-called add-on store. So, for all those who are just starting with the topic, this might be a bit overwhelming. You essentially have a limited selection of add-ons that you can use, and the complete Home Assistant is not fully available. I would only choose this option if you really have no other choice. So if you have something set up somewhere and want to try it out, then you can do that. Otherwise, I would rather advise against it. The second option is the so-called Home Assistant Supervised. This option is for those who would like to install the operating system themselves and are willing to tinker a bit more. So you basically have to install your operating system yourself, install Docker, and then you can install Home Assistant Supervised on it. I have actually experimented the most with this option in the past. However, it also has the downside. That Home Assistant is relatively, how should I put it, finicky when it comes to other applications that you run on this machine. So it can really only be used for Home Assistant. And accordingly, I would now advise against this option. Simply because you can use Home Assistant as a container version if you say you want to run other things on it and set everything up yourself, you can indeed set it up yourself. Or if you are completely new, use the third method to set everything up because it is simply much easier. And in principle, you will have exactly the same installation as with Home Assistant Supervised. And that brings us to the third version, which I would definitely recommend, and that is the so-called Home Assistant OS. This is basically a completely ready-made operating system, and I would definitely recommend it to you for getting started. There you can install a lot of additional things and you don't have to worry about updates, configuration, etc. This brings us to the installation, which can vary quite a bit depending on which server you have chosen. If you have a NAS, you just need to go to the respective app store and install the Home Assistant container from there. If you have a Raspberry Pi, you are probably using the micro SD card that can be inserted into the back of the Raspberry Pi. Alternatively, if you are using a thin client, you can usually plug in a so-called M.2 drive. Or if you decide to go for a regular computer, you might also consider an SSD. In any case, there are also two different ways to install everything in 2021. If you compare this to a Windows installation, you would essentially have a completely pre-built computer where you just insert the hard drives, SSDs, and everything else already set up, and in the end, you have a USB stick that you plug into the computer to start the operating system. From there, the operating system is then installed onto your hard drives. It's basically a kind of installer that you run after you have created a bootable USB stick. That's not how it works with Home Assistant using the OS. Instead, you need to create a ready-made hard drive directly, and from that, you can then boot your Home Assistant. That is basically the completed installation. So, instead of putting an installer on a USB stick, you use the ready-made Home Assistant directly. One can also take a detour and first boot Linux from a USB stick and then create a hard drive from there. 2001. However, it is easier if you connect the medium that you want to use to start Home Assistant directly to your PC. In the case of the Raspberry Pi, it is the micro SD card that you connect to the computer. If you decide to go for a computer, then the SSD, and if you are using a thin client, then the NVMe, PCI SSD, whatever it may be. So it's best to check in advance what you want to install everything on and then order a suitable adapter directly with it. Usually, you can find them relatively cheaply on Amazon, for example. An NVMe USB adapter, SATA USB adapter, or microSD USB adapter. For simplicity, I will now use the Raspberry Pi, so I will get a microSD card and a microSD adapter, connect everything to the computer, and then we will install it all together. So, as you can see, I have already opened the Home Assistant page here, and if you are using a Raspberry Pi, you can now directly use the Raspberry Pi imager. For the sake of simplicity, I am now using Balena Etcher as it is essentially the same for all operating systems. First, we need to obtain the download for the Home Assistant OS. Here in the guide that I have linked for you below for the Raspberry Pi, you can simply select which Raspberry Pi you are using. In my case, the Raspberry Pi 4, copy the link here and then go into the program Balena Etcher, which is also linked in the description. I have already installed that here. After I have copied the URL, I go to Flash from URL, simply paste the URL here and press OK. And after he has verified it here, I can simply click on Select Target, choose the SD card, press Select, and then click on Flash here. Now I need to enter my password here again, and then the image will be downloaded and flashed onto the SD card simultaneously. While the installation is taking place, I will show you the instructions for a regular computer once again. So, here you see Download the image. You would right-click and click Copy Link Address, and you can already see down here that this is a similar link to the one I just copied. You would simply take it, insert it, flash it onto the SSD, and from there it would work just like it does for the Raspberry Pi. Then you would remove the SD card, take it, and plug it into the back of the Raspberry Pi. Then we need a USB-C power supply and of course a network connection. We plug everything in, and ideally the Raspberry Pi should now start up in the background and automatically set up the entire OS. What you need to do now to start setting up Home Assistant is either to log into your router and check which IP address the device has received, or alternatively, enter Home Assistant. Local 8123 in the browser's address bar, and if you're lucky, it will work directly with that. Alternatively, I just use the IP address now because I already have several Home Assistant instances running here. And as you can see, you then arrive at this interface, and it is currently downloading all the things you need for Home Assistant in parallel. This will just take a moment. And when it's finished, we can set up Home Assistant directly. So, that's it. The installation is complete. Now we can start with the setup then. To do this, I will click here to create my smart home, give it a name, set up our account, and I can also enter the address now, Berlin, continue. Then I can support Home Assistant here. Of course, I am happy to do that. And now it has already recognized some devices here. However, I will ignore that for now and click on Finisher. So with that, I have set up my Home Assistant OS and can now start adding integrations, adding devices, 2000 and so on. We will take a look at this in the next video, going completely through the interface for beginners and seeing how to add devices, how to edit dashboards and so on. If you want to check this out, feel free to come back next week. Otherwise, if you have any questions about it, please write them in the comments. And if you don't want to miss anything, click subscribe. We'll see you again next week. Until then, take care and goodbye.